It was a cold October evening in the quiet Dutch village of Ruinerwold. The streets were empty, save for the occasional glow of streetlights casting faint shadows on cobbled roads. This village, like so many others, had an air of calm that rarely stirred. People here lived predictable, uneventful lives. Inside a small bar, Café de Castelline, the warmth of flickering lamps and low conversation filled the space. Chris Westerbeek, the bartender, went about his routine, wiping down glasses and checking on regular patrons who occupied their usual spots. The hum of an old football match on the television provided background noise. Nothing about the night hinted at the storm brewing just beyond the bar's doors. The entrance creaked open. Everyone glanced up briefly, just another newcomer, they thought. But there was something unusual about this figure. The young man who stepped inside appeared uneasy, as though the very act of crossing the threshold had cost him more than anyone could understand. His clothes were mismatched and unkempt, layers hanging loosely over his gaunt frame. His movements were stiff, deliberate, like he was unsure of his surroundings. A silence followed him as he took a seat in the far corner, shrinking into the shadows of the dimly lit bar. Chris watched him carefully, noting the boy's pale skin, hollow cheeks, and the sharp, restless movement of his eyes. He looked less like someone passing through and more like someone who had escaped something terrifying. Curious and concerned, Chris approached, offering a drink and a friendly presence. At first the young man sat silently, staring into the glass in front of him, his knuckles white as he gripped it. Slowly, he began to speak, his voice thin and broken, words disjointed as though they hadn't been used in years. He spoke about a hidden place, a farmhouse surrounded by fields where he and his brothers and sisters had been kept away from the world. He said they had been there for as long as he could remember, trapped under the will of their father, who believed the outside world was corrupt and doomed to destruction. Chris listened, feeling his heartbeat quicken with every detail. The young man's story was impossible to believe, yet told with such raw desperation that it could only be true. He described escaping through a small window, waiting until everyone was asleep before sneaking out and walking for hours through the darkness. It was the first time he had been free, but he didn't feel safe. His father would come looking for him. The fear in his eyes made that clear. The bartender didn't hesitate. Whatever this young man had endured, he couldn't face it alone. Without further discussion, Chris stepped away and made a quiet call to the police, explaining the situation as calmly as possible. There was no clear way to describe what he had just heard, just fragments of a story that hinted at something dark and unfathomable. By the time the police arrived, the young man had given them enough to act. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, each detail painting a clearer picture of his life on the farm. His father had raised them to believe they were the only survivors of a fallen world. There were 6 siblings, all hidden, and none of them had ever seen anything beyond the confines of the farmhouse. Their father controlled every aspect of their lives, from what they ate to how they spent each moment of their days. His word was law, and questioning him was unthinkable. When asked to lead them to the farm, the young man hesitated. The thought of returning seemed unbearable, yet he knew it was the only way to save his siblings. Finally, he relented, pointing out the direction on a map as officers prepared to head out. That night, police vehicles made their way down winding, unmarked roads through the Dutch countryside. The darkness seemed thicker here, the land untouched and wild. It was easy to miss the farmhouse, hidden at the end of a narrow dirt path, its silhouette blending into the surrounding trees. The building was old and worn, its windows boarded up, its doors locked tight. To the untrained eye, it appeared abandoned, but closer inspection revealed otherwise. A faint glow seeped through one of the boarded windows, a sign that life lingered behind those walls. The officers approached carefully, flashlights slicing through the darkness. They called out, their voices echoing through the still night, but no answer came. Inside they could hear movement, soft shuffling, hurried footsteps like someone trying to hide. Backup was called, and minutes later, the farmhouse doors were forced open. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The officers moved cautiously, their beams of light illuminating a strange and unsettling interior. It was as though time had stopped. Old furniture, stacks of canned food, and farming tools cluttered the space, but there were no signs of modern life, no technology, no electricity beyond the faint hum of a generator somewhere deep within the house. And then they found it, a hidden staircase behind a wardrobe. Descending into the basement, the officers discovered what the young man had described, a concealed room where 5 more siblings sat huddled together. They were pale, thin, and silent, their eyes wide and uncomprehending as they stared at the uniformed strangers. The room itself was small, bare, and claustrophobic, with makeshift bedding on the floor and shelves stocked with supplies. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker. At the center of it all was their father, Gerrit Jan van Dorsten. He stood rigid, his presence commanding despite his frail, aging frame. His gaze was cold and calculating, and he offered no resistance as the police approached him. It was as though he had known this moment would come but refused to acknowledge it until now. The officers led the children out one by one, their thin bodies illuminated by the flashlights. Outside, the world they had been taught to fear stretched endlessly before them. For the first time, they saw the sky unfiltered, the stars sprawling above like distant, unfamiliar specters. As the youngest child was carried into the safety of a police car, the farmhouse seemed to sigh under the weight of its secrets. Years of isolation, control, and hidden lives had finally come to light. Back at the station, the eldest son sat quietly still, processing what he had done. His escape had shattered the only life he had ever known, but it had also saved them all. For the first time, there was hope. In the days following the raid, the story began to emerge. Gerrit Jan van Dorsten, a former carpenter and member of the Unification Church, had developed extreme beliefs about the end of the world. He convinced himself, and later his children, that society was corrupt, doomed, and that survival depended on complete isolation. After his wife's death, Gerrit Jan moved his children to the remote farmhouse in Ruinerwold, effectively cutting ties with the outside world. The farmhouse became their prison. The children were raised in near-total isolation, their lives governed by strict rules. They were homeschooled in a rigid, twisted ideology that painted the world as evil. The basement served as their primary living quarters, stocked with canned goods, supplies, and farming tools. While they were taught to grow vegetables and raise animals for sustenance, they were deprived of basic freedoms, contact with others, education beyond their father's teachings, or any access to modern society. Most horrifyingly, the children were not registered with Dutch authorities, meaning they did not exist on paper. They had never been to school, a doctor, or even seen strangers. Their father believed that by keeping them isolated and obedient, he was saving them from the sins of the world. The story took an even darker turn with the arrest of Joseph Brunner, an Austrian man in his late 50s who rented the farmhouse and acted as Gerrit Jan's accomplice. Described as a handyman and outsider, Joseph became the gatekeeper of the family's hidden life. He handled external tasks, shopping for groceries, fixing tools, and interacting with the neighbors. But he did so alone. When asked about the farmhouse, he told neighbors and authorities that he lived there alone, a lie that maintained the family's secrecy for so long. Joseph's relationship with Gerrit Jan appeared almost fanatical. Authorities discovered that Joseph followed the father's apocalyptic beliefs and helped orchestrate the isolation. He built the hidden staircase and basement room that became the children's living quarters. Without his cooperation, the family's disappearance into obscurity might not have been so complete. After their rescue, the physical and psychological condition of the children was a stark reminder of their suffering. Malnourished and pale, they bore the physical toll of their confinement. The eldest son, who had escaped, appeared more resilient but carried the emotional weight of protecting his siblings while living under their father's rule. He described a daily life of fear, obedience, and survival. Psychologists and social workers tasked with caring for the children quickly realized the depth of their trauma. The siblings struggled to adapt to the outside world, which was unfamiliar and overwhelming. Basic interactions, ordering food, speaking to strangers, or using technology, were alien concepts. They had spent their formative years trapped in a mental and physical prison, their understanding of reality warped by their father's teachings. The youngest child, a girl of 16, had never known a world beyond the walls of the farmhouse. Her innocence had been replaced with a quiet fear of everything beyond her family. The others, aged 18 to 25, grappled with a mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and anger at their father for what he had done. The police investigation into Gerrit Jan van Dorsten and Joseph Brunner revealed chilling details about the family's life. Gerrit Jan's stroke had left him physically weakened, but his control over his children remained unbroken. He used a combination of religious ideology and psychological manipulation to maintain their obedience. Joseph acted as his accomplice, ensuring that no one ever discovered the truth. Authorities also discovered evidence of the father's disturbing practices. Journals and writings detailed his apocalyptic beliefs and plans for his children. Gerrit Jan viewed himself as a prophet, chosen to guide his family through the end of days. This delusion shaped every aspect of their lives, trapping his children in a cycle of fear and dependence. Josef Brunner, meanwhile, was charged with complicity in the unlawful detention of the family. He denied responsibility, claiming he was merely helping a friend. However, the evidence painted a different story. Gerrit Jan van Dorsten was never formally sentenced because he was declared unfit for trial. Following a debilitating stroke in 2016, he was left partially paralyzed and unable to speak. The Dutch court dropped the charges, including allegations of unlawful detention, child abuse, and sexual assault, citing his inability to follow proceedings or assist in his defense. Let me know, what do you think of this case and which you would like to see next? Till next time.